The December wind howled outside, rattling the frostbitten windows of a modest home in a quiet New England town. Inside, the fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm, flickering glow over the living room. A faint, haunting melody echoed through the house, not from a radio or a phone, but from an old music box sitting on the mantel. Its sound was both familiar and strange, like a whisper from the past. Edward Greene, slouched in an armchair, stared at the music box with a furrowed brow. His gray eyes, dulled with years of sorrow, reflected the warm light of the fire, but betrayed little of the comfort it should have brought. He'd forgotten he even owned the music box, though its intricate carvings were unmistakable. He hadn't seen it in years, not since the last Christmas he shared with Margaret, his late wife. The music box was more than just an ornament, it was a part of their story. Edward stared at the music box, his brows knitting in confusion. "I didn't wind it," he murmured to himself. How had it started playing? The thought lingered, unsettling him. Was it a coincidence or something else? Clara noticed his furrowed expression but said nothing, though a faint smile tugged at her lips as she returned to the kitchen. Margaret had cherished it, winding it every year on Christmas Eve to fill the house with its soft rendition of Silent Night. But since her passing, the box had disappeared into the attic, along with so many other remnants of their life together. Edward hadn't wound it himself, yet now, here it was, playing as if Margaret herself had touched it. "Grandpa!" A cheerful voice broke through his reverie. Lily, his 8-year-old granddaughter, ran into the room, her arms full of garland. Her brother, Max, followed close behind, balancing a precarious stack of ornaments. Edward forced a smile for their sake. "What's all this?" he asked, though his voice lacked its old warmth. "Decorating, of course," Lily said, grinning. She looked at the music box. "Oh, I love that sound. Did you turn it on, Grandpa?" "No," Edward replied, his voice quieter now. "I haven't touched that thing in years." Clara, his daughter, appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Dad, I didn't even know you still had that. I thought it got lost in the move." Edward shook his head, his fingers twitching in his lap. "So did I." The conversation moved on, with Clara directing the children to hang garlands and ornaments. But Edward's attention remained fixed on the music box. Its presence felt almost intrusive, like a ghost from a life he'd tried to bury. The evening unfolded in a slow, familiar rhythm. Clara and her husband, Peter, worked in the kitchen, while Lily and Max buzzed around the living room, filling it with their excited chatter. The smell of roasting ham and spiced cider wafted through the house, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree. Yet for all the warmth and life around him, Edward felt like an outsider, watching from behind an invisible wall. It wasn't until dinner was nearly ready that the music box came back into focus. Lily and Max, now thoroughly invested in their search for hidden Christmas treasures, had unearthed an old chest of family keepsakes. Among them were faded photographs, Margaret's favorite scarf, and a dusty tin of sheet music. "Grandpa, you have to see this," Max called out, holding up a fragile yellowed photo. It showed Edward and Margaret in their youth, laughing as they sat together at a piano. Edward's breath caught. He hadn't seen that photo in decades. Margaret's radiant smile seemed to leap from the paper, pulling at his chest like a tether to a time he could never reclaim. "Look at this one, too," Lily added, holding up another photo of Edward on a grand stage, his hands poised dramatically over the piano keys. "Grandpa, were you famous?" Max asked, his eyes wide with admiration. Edward chuckled softly, though it was tinged with sadness. "Once upon a time," he said. Clara, now kneeling beside the children, glanced up at her father. "You never talk about those days anymore. Why not?" Edward didn't answer. Instead, his eyes drifted back to the music box. Its melody had stopped, leaving an almost oppressive silence in its wake. He rose from his chair, something he rarely did without prompting, and crossed the room to the mantel. The box was lighter than he remembered. He ran his fingers over its delicate carvings of holly leaves and berries, his thumb brushing the faint initials MG etched into the underside. Margaret Greene, "Do you want to wind it up again?" Clara asked gently. For a moment, Edward said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, he turned the small brass key. The mechanism clicked faintly before the first notes of Silent Night filled the room once more. The melody was pure and haunting, resonating with an almost magical clarity that silenced even the children. Edward closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. Memories came rushing back, Margaret's laughter, the sound of her voice as she hummed along, the feeling of her hand on his as they danced in the living room. He could almost hear her whisper, "Play it again, Edward." "Dad?" Clara's voice pulled him back to the present. Edward opened his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. He hadn't realized he was crying. "This music box," he said hoarsely, "was Margaret's favorite thing. She said it held all the memories of our Christmases together." "It's beautiful," Lily said softly, her small hand resting on her grandfather's arm. "Will you tell us about her, Grandpa?" Edward hesitated. The memories were as painful as they were precious. Sharing them felt like reopening an old wound. But as he looked at Lily's eager face and Max's wide eyes, he felt something stir within him, a small flicker of the man he used to be. "Maybe," he said finally, "but not all at once. There's too much to tell in just one night." The children seemed satisfied with this answer, but Clara wasn't so easily placated. As she rose and returned to the kitchen, she cast a lingering glance at her father, her expression a mixture of hope and worry. That night, long after the house had fallen silent, Edward sat alone by the fire. The music box rested on the table beside him, its melody still echoing faintly in his mind. He picked it up again, turning it over in his hands. It was then he noticed something he hadn't before, a small inscription inside the lid, hidden beneath the winding mechanism, for the music that lives in us forever. Edward's heart clenched. He had always thought of the music box as Margaret's, but now he realized it had always been their shared treasure, a vessel for the music and love they had created together. As the fire crackled softly and the music box gleamed in the dim light, Edward made a decision. He glanced at the inscription inside the lid, running his fingers over the words, "For the music that lives in us forever." It was as though Margaret had left him one final message, urging him to play not just for her, but for the family they had built together. A small, hesitant smile touched his lips. Tomorrow he would sit at the piano again for the first time in years. Morning broke gently over the quiet New England town, casting long shadows across the frost-covered rooftops. Inside Clara's home, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the lingering aromas of last night's Christmas Eve dinner. The house was alive with the muted sounds of early morning activity. Clara preparing breakfast, Peter rummaging through the closet for coats, and the kids debating whether stockings could be opened before the adults were awake. But in the living room, something extraordinary was happening. Edward sat at the grand piano. His back was straight, his hands rested lightly on the keys, and his eyes were closed as though he were bracing himself for an overwhelming wave. The music box sat nearby, its presence almost commanding him to play. The soft light of dawn illuminated the piano's polished surface, and for a moment, Edward could see himself as he once was young, vibrant, a man whose life revolved around music. He pressed a single key. The note hung in the air, pure and resonant. It felt foreign, yet achingly familiar, like speaking a language he hadn't used in decades. He pressed another, then another, until a tentative melody began to form that mirrored the tune of the music box. As he played, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the first time he met Margaret at a holiday recital where she sang in the choir. She'd been radiant, her voice filling the hall with a warmth that rivaled the crackling fireplace. He had been an accompanist then, nervous and unsure of himself, but when their eyes met across the room, something clicked. It wasn't long before they were inseparable, their lives intertwined with music. "Grandpa?" Edward's fingers froze on the keys. He turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, her hair still tousled from sleep. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. Edward managed a small smile. "It's all right, sweetheart, come here." Lily padded across the room and climbed onto the bench beside him, her wide eyes studying his hands on the keys. "I didn't know you could play," she said in awe. "I used to," Edward admitted, "a long time ago." "Why did you stop?" Edward hesitated. How could he explain the weight of grief to an 8-year-old? The way Margaret's absence had turned every note into a painful echo of what he'd lost. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "when you lose someone you love, it feels like nothing else matters anymore. Even the things that used to make you happy." Lily looked thoughtful. "But Grandma wouldn't want you to stop, would she?" Her words hit Edward like a bolt of lightning. Margaret had always been his greatest supporter, his muse. She would never have wanted him to abandon music. "No," Edward said softly, "she wouldn't." By now, the rest of the family had begun to stir. Clara appeared in the doorway, followed by Peter and Max, all of them freezing in place when they saw Edward at the piano. "Dad," Clara said, her voice catching, "you're playing!" Edward nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he continued to pick out the melody. "It's been a long time." Clara stepped closer, her eyes misting. "I didn't think I'd ever hear you play again." Neither did I, Edward thought. Peter, who had been quietly observing, approached with a cup of coffee. "You know, Margaret told Clara once how much she loved this music box," he said softly. "She always believed it brought the family together." Edward glanced at him, surprised by the comment. "Did she?" Peter nodded. "She was right, you know. Look at us now." The family gathered around as he played, the music box's melody blending with the notes from the piano. It was imperfect, hesitant, but it was enough to stir something deep within them, a sense of connection, of shared history. But as Edward played, the memories became more vivid, and with them came a pang of guilt. He had spent so much time mourning Margaret that he had neglected the family still around him. Clara had tried for years to bridge the gap, to bring him back to the world of the living, but he had pushed her away, retreating into his sorrow. When the song ended, Edward turned to his daughter. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara frowned. "Sorry? For what?" "For shutting you out," Edward said. "For letting my grief take me away from you and the kids. I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was build a wall between us." Clara's eyes softened. "Dad, I understood. I still do. But I've missed you so much." Before Edward could respond, Max chimed in. "Can you teach us how to play, Grandpa?" Edward blinked, taken aback. "You want to learn?" "Yeah," Max said, his face lighting up. "Grandma taught Mom when she was little, right? You could teach us too." Edward's gaze flicked to Clara, who nodded. "Mom always said you were the best teacher she ever had." The idea both terrified and thrilled him. Teaching the kids could be a way to reconnect with the music and with Margaret's memory, but it also meant confronting the part of himself he had buried. "I'll try," Edward said at last, his voice trembling. "But you'll have to be patient with me." The kids cheered, and Clara smiled, her expression full of hope. That afternoon, as Edward sat with Lily and Max at the piano, guiding their small hands over the keys, he began to feel something he hadn't in years. A flicker of joy. The music, once a source of pain, was becoming a bridge not just to his past, but to his family's future. That evening, Clara revealed a surprise of her own. She handed Edward a folder filled with old letters Margaret had written, but never sent. In them, Margaret had written about her dream of creating a family tradition centered around music. "Mom always wanted us to play together," Clara said. "She thought music could keep us close no matter what happened." Edward held the letters with trembling hands. It was as though Margaret's voice was speaking to him from beyond, urging him to embrace the life and the family he still had. He unfolded another letter, his hands trembling as he read, "Edward, your music has always been the soul of this family. Even when life feels too heavy to bear, don't let it silence you. The children need to hear the songs that brought us together, just as much as you need to play them." A tear slipped down Edward's cheek as he folded the letter carefully. "You were right, Margaret," he whispered. "It's time. If the music stops, Edward, so does the joy. I know life without me will feel quiet, but remember our love was always loud enough to echo forever. Let it guide you back to them." Edward opened one of the letters and found a sketch tucked inside a drawing of their family, gathered around the piano, with the music box sitting on top. Written below was a single phrase, "For the music that lives in us forever." That evening, as the snow blanketed the quiet town, Edward felt an unexpected lightness. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within, yet for the first time, he welcomed it. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart swelling. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her father, the man who had been a ghost in their lives for so long, was coming back to them. The music box sat on the piano, its lid propped open, as if presiding over the reunion. Later that night, as the children slept, Edward remained at the piano. The house was quiet now, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards and the soft hum of the wind outside. The letters Clara had given him sat on the music stand, their contents swirling in his mind. He opened another letter, his hands trembling slightly. "My dearest Edward," it began. "Every year when you play, I feel like the world fades away, and it's just us. I hope you'll keep playing, even when I can't be there to listen." Edward's chest tightened. Margaret's words were like a melody all their own, each one striking a chord deep within him. He ran his fingers over the music box, winding it once more. As its gentle tune filled the room, Edward found himself playing along, his hands moving over the keys with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Edward surprised everyone by joining them in the kitchen. He helped Clara prepare breakfast, something he hadn't done in years. They really talked for the first time since Margaret's passing. Edward shared stories from his youth, anecdotes about Margaret, and even tales from his days as a concert pianist. The children were enthralled, hanging on his every word. "I had no idea Grandma was such a good singer," Lily said. "Oh, she was extraordinary," Edward replied, his voice warm with pride. "She had a way of turning every song into something magical." The conversations continued throughout the day, weaving a tapestry of memories that brought the family closer together. But as the hours passed, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the music box than he'd realized. That evening, as the snowstorm intensified outside, Edward decided to take a closer look. He brought the music box to the table, examining its intricate carvings and delicate mechanism. Edward hesitated as he examined the box, running his fingers over its carvings. Something felt different. He tapped the underside and heard a faint hollow sound. Frowning, he pressed against the base, and to his surprise, a small panel shifted. As he turned it over, he noticed a small compartment he hadn't seen before, hidden beneath a false bottom. "What's that?" Clara asked, noticing his discovery. "I'm not sure," Edward replied, carefully prying open the compartment. Inside was a folded piece of sheet music, yellowed with age. He unfolded it, his breath catching as he read the title. "For Margaret." "It's a song," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "One I wrote for her years ago, but I thought I'd lost it." Clara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the notes. "Dad, this is beautiful. You should play it." Edward hesitated. The song was unfinished, its final measures left blank. He remembered why he'd planned to complete it with Margaret, but life had gotten in the way. Now, it felt like a piece of her was still with him, waiting to help him finish what they had started. "I don't know if I can," Edward admitted. "Yes, you can," Clara said, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You've already come this far." With a deep breath, Edward sat down at the piano. He placed the sheet music on the stand and began to play. The notes were hesitant at first, like a conversation long forgotten, but soon they flowed more freely. The melody was tender and haunting, filled with longing and love. As the music filled the room, Edward could feel Margaret's presence as though she were standing beside him. It was as if the music box had unlocked not just memories, but a part of his soul he thought he had lost forever. The children crept downstairs, drawn by the sound. They sat on the floor, watching in awe as their grandfather played. Even Peter, who had always been reserved around Edward, seemed moved by the music. When the song reached its unfinished section, Edward paused, his hands hovering over the keys. Edward's hands froze, hovering over the keys. The empty measures on the page seemed to mirror the silence Margaret had left behind, a void he wasn't sure how to fill. His breath hitched as he searched for the courage to continue. "Grandpa, what happens next?" Lily asked softly. Edward smiled, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I think that's for us to decide, together." Over the next few hours, the family worked to complete the song. Clara added lyrics inspired by Margaret's letters, while the children contributed their own ideas for the melody. Even Peter, hesitant at first, offered suggestions for harmonies. "What if we add this here?" Clara suggested, pointing to a phrase in the melody. Edward nodded, a smile breaking through his concentration. Max clumsily tapped out a few notes, giggling as Edward corrected him. Even Peter, hesitant at first, leaned in to suggest a harmony. When they reached the final measures, Edward paused, his hands trembling over the keys. The room held its breath. Slowly, he played the notes, filling in the silence with the love and longing that had lived in his heart for years. The final chord rang out, rich and full, like the ending of a story he hadn't realized he'd been telling all along. By the time they finished, the storm outside had subsided, leaving the world blanketed in a glistening layer of snow. The family gathered around the piano, singing the completed song together. It was a moment Edward knew he would treasure forever. For the first time in years, he felt whole, not because the pain of losing Margaret had disappeared, but because he had found a way to carry her memory forward. Clara sighed, her frustration bubbling over. Her patience, worn thin by years of trying to reach her father, finally gave way. "Dad, it's not just about you missing Mom. We've missed you too, and it's like you didn't even try to stay with us." Edward's jaw tightened. "You think I didn't try? Every day has been a fight to keep going without her." Their eyes met, both reflecting years of unspoken pain. Clara softened, reaching for his hand. "I know, Dad. I just wish you'd let us fight with you." When the song ended, Edward turned to his family, his heart full. Edward glanced at the music box one last time, hearing Margaret's voice in the back of his mind. She had always believed in the power of music, not just to remember, but to heal. "She was right," he murmured. "This is how we keep her with us." "This," he said, gesturing to the piano, the music box, and the people around him, "is what Margaret always wanted. For us to be together, sharing music, sharing love." The music box sat quietly on the piano, its tune dormant for now. But Edward knew its song would live on, not just in its delicate mechanism, but in the hearts of his family and in the music they created together. As the evening drew to a close, Edward wound the music box one last time. Its melody filled the room, weaving together the past and present in a harmony that felt eternal. The inscription inside the lid seemed to glow in the firelight, "For the music that lives in us forever." And Edward, for the first time in years, truly believed it. Edward woke on Christmas morning to the sound of distant church bells, mingling with the soft rustle of snowflakes brushing against the windows. For the first time in years, the heaviness in his chest felt less like a burden and more like a quiet memory. The music box rested on the table beside him, its lid closed, as though waiting patiently for its next song. Downstairs, the house was alive with the quiet, cozy sounds of a family Christmas. Clara was in the kitchen, humming an old carol as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. Peter was setting the table, his footsteps light and quick as he tried to avoid stepping on the children's toys scattered on the floor. Lily and Max had already dug into their stockings, their laughter floating up to Edward like a melody. He sat up slowly, his movements stiff from a restless night of thought. The sheet music they had worked on the night before was still in his mind, its melody weaving through his dreams. Each note felt like a piece of Margaret, a reminder of her love, her spirit, and the life they had built together. When Edward came downstairs, the children greeted him with the exuberance only children could muster on Christmas morning. "Grandpa, look at this!" Max exclaimed, holding up a plastic model of a race car. Lily tugged on Edward's sleeve. "Did you see the snow? It's perfect for building snowmen." Edward chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Snowmen, huh? We'll see about that after breakfast." Clara smiled as she brought over a steaming pot of coffee. "Morning, Dad. You're up early." Edward took the coffee with a grateful nod. "Couldn't sleep much. Too much music in my head, I suppose." Clara's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but she said nothing, only squeezed his arm as she passed him. After breakfast, the family gathered around the tree for presents. The children tore into their gifts with abandon, their excited shouts filling the room. Clara and Peter exchanged a knowing glance, their smiles full of love and contentment. Edward, however, sat quietly, watching it all with a thoughtful expression. The music box was in his lap again, his fingers tracing its carvings. He cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I have something I want to share," he began, his voice steady but soft. The room fell silent, the children pausing in their unwrapping to listen. "This music box," Edward said, holding it up, "isn't just an object. It's a piece of our family's story. Your grandmother and I found it years ago in a little shop during one of our first Christmases together. She loved it from the moment she saw it. Every year she would wind it and its song would fill the house, just like it did last night." He paused, his throat tightening. "When she passed, I put it away because I thought it hurt too much to hear it. But now I realize the music box wasn't meant to remind me of what I'd lost. It's meant to remind me of what I still have and what I can share with all of you." Clara wiped a tear from her cheek. Lily and Max exchanged wide-eyed looks, as though seeing their grandfather in a new light. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" Lily asked. Edward smiled gently. "I mean, this music box is going to stay with the family. It's not just mine anymore, it's ours. And every Christmas, we'll play its song together. We'll add to it, change it, and make it something that connects all of us, no matter where we are or how much time passes." The children clapped, their excitement bubbling over. Clara placed a hand on Edward's shoulder, her eyes shining with gratitude. "That's a beautiful idea, Dad," she said softly. The rest of the day unfolded like a perfect Christmas story. Edward ventured outside with the children to build not one, but 2 snowmen. Max insisted on using his new scarf to give one snowman a proper gentlemanly appearance, while Lily decorated the other with pine cones for buttons. Edward found himself laughing more than he had in years, his cheeks rosy from the cold and joy. Later, they all returned inside for hot cocoa and stories by the fire. Edward shared tales of his childhood Christmases, of his first piano recital, and of the Christmas when he proposed to Margaret, hiding the ring inside a sheet music folder. The family hung on his every word, their hearts warming with each new detail. As evening fell, Clara suggested they play the song they had completed together the night before. Edward agreed, his heart swelling with pride as the children scrambled to the piano. This time, it was a true family performance. Edward played the melody, Clara sang the lyrics, and Lily and Max added their own playful flourishes on the higher keys. Even Peter joined in, tapping out a simple harmony that made the children giggle. When the song ended, the house fell into a peaceful silence. Edward closed his eyes, letting the echoes of their music wash over him. It was then that Clara brought out one last surprise. She handed Edward a wrapped package, her smile tinged with a hint of mischief. "This is for you, Dad, from all of us." Edward unwrapped it carefully, revealing a leather-bound book. Inside were blank pages interspersed with family photos, including some from the past few days. Edward's fingers trembled as he traced the embossed cover. He felt as though Clara had handed him a piece of Margaret's heart, preserved in ink and paper. The thought filled him with both a bittersweet ache and a quiet sense of gratitude. "It's a family music journal," Clara explained. "We thought we could use it to write down our songs, our memories, and maybe even some stories, something to pass down, just like the music box." Edward's throat tightened as he ran his fingers over the cover. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Edward opened the journal to the first blank page. With deliberate care, he wrote Margaret's inscription, "For the music that lives in us forever." Below it, he added his own words, "May this journal carry our songs, our stories, and our love through generations." He set the pen down, his heart full. "This is how we keep her with us," he said softly. That night, long after the children had gone to bed, Edward sat by the fire with the journal and the music box. He wound the box one last time, letting its melody guide his thoughts. As the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, Edward began to write. He wrote about Margaret, about their life together, and about the family they had built. He wrote about the music box and the way it had brought them all together. And as he wrote, he felt a deep, unshakable peace. Margaret's voice echoed in his mind, not as a memory, but as a presence warm, loving, and eternal. When the melody ended, Edward closed the journal, his heart full. The music box sat quietly on the mantel, its song now a part of their family's legacy. The inscription inside the lid gleamed in the firelight, "For the music that lives in us forever." Edward gazed at the snow outside, the soft glow of Christmas lights illuminating the quiet street. For the first time in years, the silence felt full not of emptiness, but of love. The music had found him again, and with it, the family Margaret had dreamed of. Edward smiled. He had finally found his song again, and in doing so, he had given his family a gift that would resonate for generations. The house was quiet now, the faint hum of the wind outside mingling with the soft crackle of the fire. The music box sat on the mantel, its melody resting for the night, but lingering in Edward's mind. He glanced around the room, at the snow-covered windows, the sleeping children, and the journal on the table. For the first time in years, the house felt whole. As he turned to climb the stairs, the faint echo of Silent Night seemed to follow him, as if Margaret herself were humming him to sleep.